Okay, yes, thank you. So yeah, my name's Andrew Martin, and I'm gonna be talking about agential distortion and critical curriculum studies. If some of that doesn't make sense right now, that's okay. But I want you to think of, I'm gonna give two quick examples of things to think about. First is a law student avoids difficult classes in order to maintain a higher GPA. And then despite being unchallenged, they achieve their goal of having a higher GPA. However, they end up being rejected by a law school in favor of another student who has a lower GPA, and because it is told to them that LSAT scores, which are just a form of standardized like law tests, matter more for college rankings. So I'm going to be coming back to these at the end, but just in general, think about what like has happened in these cases. And what I believe is going on in part is what I'm going to call agential distortion. Now, here's just kind of an overview for how the presentation is going to go, because there's going to be some technical terms, and I just kind of want to lay out this like path. So I'm going to talk about briefly about my initial findings. I'm going to talk about who's involved. Then I'm going to go into a bit about curriculum theory and their accounts of agency. Then I'm going to use philosophy of agency to reveal like an expanded account. And then at the very end, we'll actually get into how this all relates to what I'm calling agential distortion. So there's kind of the path we're going down. So my initial findings are 2-point. They're based around current work being done in curriculum studies within education and research and philosophy of action exploring agency. In reviewing parts of each respective field, I believe there's a broader project that is worth outlining. This is the project of developing an account of agency and mitigating what I'm calling agential distortion. My broad conclusion is that by clarifying curricular theories, accounts of agency through work done in areas such as philosophy of agency, there will be both an improved account of what agency can be and how it operates within educational environments, and a clearer understanding of agential distortion due to explicit conceptualizations of dilemmas that occur. But this is all fairly technical, so I'm going to try and clear things up by going back to some initials at first. What I believe these different areas of research are involved in doing. So who's involved? As mentioned, I talk about curriculum theorists and agency theorists. Curriculum theorists are going to be interested in expressing an educational goal that is guided by their values. That's the first thing that most of them are going to have in common, right? I do want to stress that not every curriculum theorist, in fact, most do not share values in terms of like how things should be done. There ends up being camps and little groups, which I think that's fine. And them being informed by their values is not a detriment, right? This is not to suggest that curriculum theorists use their values exclusively in place of empirical findings. Rather, that to participate in curricular theory is to take up a collection of values that are argued to be the purpose of education. But this aspect of curricular history has been heavily studied, and as such, I'm not really going to be touching much more on it throughout this presentation. What I'm more interested in exploring, and we'll go into greater detail later on, is the second major factor that curriculum theorists share in common. And this is that they propose what I call a limited account of agency. Simply put, before a theorist can propose what sort of practices should be put in place, they're going to have some account of agency. Even if it is not explicitly stated as such, I think that when curricular theories are examined more closely, you are always going to find what I'm calling this limited account of agency. Now, to call it limited, I do not mean to say that their account is shallow or outright wrong somehow, but rather I mean that the conceptualization of agency curriculum theorists put forward are accounts concerned with a limited range of factors. These factors are based in their values and conceptions of the specific environments they have in mind. Commonly, it's going to be schools, it's going to be classrooms, and educational institutions of that sort. And then the next thing they're going to be doing is that this limited account is going to inform curricular theory, which in turn informs curricular practices. So it's kind of a step-by-step. This is something they all seem to be doing. Now, I've been saying agency a lot, so I haven't really explained what that means. So it might not be clear. I'm expecting it not to be clear, but that's okay. There's good news. There's an entire area of study that aims to improve our understanding of agency. And this is where agency theorists come in. They are trying to do exactly that. They want to explore what informs our conceptions of agency. Another thing that they're going to be involved in is examining how agential distortion occurs and how to mitigate it. Now I'm going to go on into a specific example of a curricular theorist before coming back to agency. I just kind of want to outline everyone that's involved. So the example I'm going to draw from right now is called critical curriculum theory. And, as mentioned before, they're going to start with a position of values. And what do they say their values are? Their values are going to be progressive agenda setting values and what some of them will call Marxist materialist values. These aren't, I'm not using these terms in like a politically loaded way. These are their own conceptualizations. They believe in equity. They think that education should be for all, especially higher ed. But even through the K through 12 setting, it's important for them to have the educational environment reflect the communities that have been underserved and mistreated over time, right? So that is their value. And this is going to give them a limited account of agency that some of them will call critical consciousness. So critical consciousness is going to have us take into consideration our social, cultural, and material environment. It's going to have us be aware of our context and external relations that inform our thinking. It's also going to have us reflect on our own thinking and structure of society. So we need to be able to kind of have it's going to be a lot of layers of reflection, seeing how society informs our thoughts, what structures in society informs our thoughts, and in turn our actions in the classroom. And so that is how acting is to be informed by these aspects. So all the actions that the curriculum theory is going to propose for critical curriculum theory is going to come out of this. Now, what's interesting is schools are considered intertwined entirely with our communities. They are not a distinct thing at all, really, outside of serving as like a mirror to a community, according to critical curriculum theory. Now, so what is agency? Well, agency is the capacity to do things that are more than mere happenings. So if a ball falls, it just kind of happens. But if you're holding the ball, you can either throw the ball, it could fall out of your hand and it might be considered an accident or not an accident. And the ability to say, oh, it was an accident or it wasn't an accident, that there's some sort of doing involved instead of it simply happening. So there's a bit more deliberacy and consideration attached to it. Agency is going to focus on a bunch of different pieces in the process of these like doings occurring, right? So agency is going to focus on goals and aims, reasons, rationality, justifications. What I'm trying to stress, agency is not a perfectly defined single thing. It is a multiplicity of different components. And agency theorists are not looking for explicit definitions. Rather, they want to examine specific features and dimensions and powers that help us understand what agency is and how it operates. So an example of like a expanded account of agency is going to be Jennifer Morton's Ecological Theory of the Norms of Practical Deliberation. That's a mouthful. So I'm going to try and break it down. Morton's going to explore how norms on intention shape practical deliberation. Also going to be looking at norms that constitute rational deliberation, and is going to argue that these depend on the interaction between two major factors. First off, an agent's psychological capacity, so these are internal factors, and an agent's environment. These are external factors. I am going to be focusing on the agent's environment, so the external factors. So the role of environment on norms of practical deliberation are going to include what's called the sociality of environments. Is going to say that the sociality of environments block what's called the appropriateness of certain deliberation. So what this means is that an environment is going to inform us as to whether or not an idea and the actions that follow from it are to be considered rational. For example, the ideas you have and carry out in order to survive on a deserted island are going to be different than the ideas and actions you carry out while here at school, I would hope. Now, another thing to take into consideration are the norms that inform deliberation, that these are dependent on specific environments of an agent. What this means is not only does an environment give us an understanding of what norms ought to be considered, we should take it to be the case that an environment is always in some way going to do this, as the norms that shape our thinking of what we do are dependent on the specific environment that an agent is in. And finally, Morton holds that extrinsic justifications must engage with empirical facts to recommend norms for our environment. Now, what has been said so far? Because I've just been saying a bunch of things. I kind of want to try and line them up. Well, curriculum theorists want us to reflect on our own thinking and structure of society, while Morden's account says external and internal structures inform deliberation. So we got some relations going on there. We also talk about consideration of our social, cultural, and material environment to curriculum theorists. And for Morden, norms are successful in some environments, but not others. And then the critical curriculum theorist is going to say context informs external relations, and this impinges on our thinking and acting. And again, Morden's going to say actions are informed by our context and external relations. So I hope we could agree there's some similarities going on here. I'm hoping I'm not speaking two different languages. So what happens if we're unaware of our environment's norms, though, to some degree? So what if their simplified values and norms are taken up by an institution? And to a certain extent, this has to be true when we're inside of an institution. We need to use grades. We need to use metrics. There's going to be institutional definitions. There's going to be what's called legible norms. So how does an institution even understand you as being part of it? Well, deliberation focuses around these simplified values and norms. And what originally mattered to us is replaced by new norms through what Nguyen calls value capture, which is what you considered to be important before is replaced by a type of clarity of a new norm. So I want to revisit the beginning really quickly here at the end. Student avoids difficult classes to maintain a higher GPA. Despite being unengaged, they achieve a 3.9 GPA. And then they are rejected. And in their place, a student with a lower GPA is selected because that other student has a higher LSAT score. What critical curriculum theory does not tell us about is how to understand these agents within the confines of an institution, such as an educational institution. It only tells us what agency is in terms of the community impacting the institution, not what does the institution itself consider agency to be. And in this case, these seem to be instances in which students are having their values distorted around the metrics that are said to be important within the institution. Wrapping up, I want to touch on why this matters. A failure to understand agential shaping, architecture, and distortion contributes to the reproduction of unwanted agential modes and a reduction of alternative modes of agency. And finally, a simplified account of agency disregards the fact that communities are not a one-to-one equivalence to institutions, just as institutions are not a one-to-one equivalence to communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. That was great. So we have time for some questions